It's Alberta versus Ottawa again, with Danielle Smith in town today at odds with the feds over her proposed restrictions on gender, healthcare and education, which go further than any other province. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was also asked for his response to the Premier's policy proposals, following a Globe and Mail report last week that his MPs were instructed not to comment on Smith's plans.
Okay, well, your question contains falsehoods. You should tell me what restrictions you're referring to. This is the problem. Justin Trudeau and the media have been spreading disinformation to distract from his doubling of housing costs, his quadrupling of the carbon tax, the crime wave that he's unleashed across the country.
There's a lot to unpack with the front bench, and they're all here to do just that. Globe and Mail, Alberta and energy reporter Kelly Kratterman is with us. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, Dan Moulton, is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Shakir Chambers worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. He's now a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Bélanger is with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And next to him, that's Laura Stone. She's a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe and Mail. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Kelly, you're in Alberta. Your eyes and ears there. I'll start with you. And sort of the question around what is motivating the Premier, before we get into the reaction here in Ottawa, like what in your view or in your assessment is motivating the Premier to do what she's doing here?
Well, I think everybody in Alberta is kind of grappling with that at this moment. What we saw as a package on trans youth and athletes last week was a lot broader than anybody was expecting. We were expecting something along the lines of Saskatchewan and New Brunswick's legislation. And I think there are a couple things motivating this. I think the first thing I have to point out is, and you brought this up during your interview with the Premier, is that she is facing a leadership review late this year in the fall. That review will be decided in large part by the most conservative elements of her party. And that part of her party is very keen on legislation like that. And regulations. And we should say, you know, this is not only legislation. There are a lot of things that they can do through regulations that we don't even know how it's going to roll out yet. I think the other thing that is motivating her, and she talked about this, is polling in Canada that shows when it comes to things like parental consent, when a child is changing their pronoun at school, there is support for, there's limited support for parents consenting on that, and there is wider support for parents being informed of it. I think there is concern from parents that there isn't a more broad-based discussion about this. But I think we have to look at, we're not only talking parental consent, we're not only talking about what seems now to be a very limited issue, we are talking about a broad swath of policies. And I think, you know, one of the things that has struck me in the last few days is I've had parents come to me and then they're asking, are we talking about consent for gender affirming treatments? Like, it's very confusing for the average exhausted parent to wade through the complexity of these issues that have been laid out all at once with no specific briefing notes for reporters, for the public, on what exactly this is going to entail.
Dan, what are your thoughts on sort of what might be behind the pursuit of this for the Premier? I thought, you know, during our interview, it became very clear, like there's no facts on the table about how many people, for example, under 18 are even getting surgery without consent. And the Premier conceded that, but then said she's concerned about what may happen. Is that, you know, the way to develop policy, or are there some risks there?
Well, it's certainly not the way that policy should be developed. And Vassy, I really can't tell you why Danielle Smith has introduced this bill, other than to acknowledge some of the points that were just made, which is that she's got a hard, far-right fringe of her party that wants to see legislation like this introduced, and they're going to hold her to account if she doesn't do it. And I think she's looking to buy herself some breathing room in the months ahead on some other policy issues that perhaps that base may not think she's going far enough on, and that this will address any sort of leadership challenges she might face in the months ahead. I mean, it is the province of Alberta. If Conservative leaders aren't conservative enough, they don't get to be Premier for very long. And so I think Danielle Smith is trying to speak to that constituency. That is probably the best explanation for it, because the rest of it defies logic. It certainly is not the kind of compassionate policy she's attempting to present it as. There are a lot of issues that poll well where the majority would love to see certain policies introduced that may infringe on minority rights, but leadership is about pushing back on that, showing compassion, and recognizing that we're talking about a pretty small minority of cases when people that advocate for these anti-trans legislation bring forward the concept. They're talking about a very minor number of circumstances, and the reality is that this bill will put a lot of people at risk, a lot of kids at risk in that province.
It's interesting also, Shakir, and Laura will know more about this as well, but late last week, when the Premier of Alberta made this announcement, questions were put to Ontario's Health Minister and Education Minister about whether they would follow suit. They're also a Conservative provincial government, and they said they had no plans to, which must say something. What do you think it does?
Yeah, I mean, this can be a very polarizing issue, despite the numbers from Angus Reid. I think, if you're a Conservative government, it might play well with some folks in your base, but generally speaking, especially in Ontario, I think there's some folks who are don't really want you to delve into this area. And I think you're seeing that play out not only in Ontario, but you played the clip with Pierre Poilievre as well, the federal Conservative leader. I mean, he could have easily just taken a position on the issue, but he chose not to, right? Because he knows, again, a polarizing issue with not a lot of tremendous political upside. So I think for most Conservative governments, whether it's a premier or a leader like Pierre, you probably just want to stay away from this unless you have that kind of hardcore base of Conservatives, like Dan pointed out in Alberta. You see some of that in Saskatchewan as well. But I don't think that kind of faction really exists widespread in Ontario.
Let's talk a little bit, Carl, about the federal reaction, because both the federal NDP but also the federal government have come out pretty strongly against this. They haven't specified what they're going to try and do to stop it, but they also don't have, to be fair to them, the specifics of how this will be tabled, legislation, right, policy, et cetera. That might not even come until the fall. What's your take on how they've been reacting?
Well, they are being very strident, and probably rightly so. But politically, when you look at the contrast between Randy Boissonnault and Premier Smith, there's one of them that's coming across as rather calm and in control, and the other one is not. And I think the reason for that is because the Liberals, they are trying to tack this on the entire Conservative movement, and they're trying to ramp it up. And that's what I heard in the words of the Liberals. What's sad about all this, Vassy, is that here we have a few number of kids, that's true, but kids that need help, that need to be loved, that need support. And instead, they are a political football. They are in the crosshairs of politicians. And that's the saddest part of this whole debacle, because really, as was mentioned, we're talking about a very few number of people, but people nonetheless that, are now know that they are a target.
Yeah, I said in the interview, the most authoritative study I could find, Laura, showed that they are 7.5 more times likely to try and attempt to commit suicide, and a number of than the rest of the population. So the risk is very real. Carl mentioned Pierre Poilievre, and your paper reported last week that there was kind of like a directive sent out to his caucus not to talk about it. He certainly, as our other panelists have pointed out, got the question, didn't seem to love the question, and didn't really answer what his position on the policy was. What do you think this ends up being an issue for them going forward?
I think he needs to get his hearing checked, because he claimed he didn't understand the question, and he actually twisted it against the media. And we've seen this now with him. When he's asked something he doesn't want to talk about or his back's up against the wall a bit, he turns it and attacks the media. And I think that is, he's going to have to be careful of that, because eventually voters do want answers on their positions. I think he came out in the second part of that question and said something generally speaking about parental rights and letting parents raise their kids. I think that's the tone he's going to try to take on this. He obviously doesn't want to wade too heavily into the debate from Danielle Smith, the specifics of her policies. He doesn't want to be talking about surgeries and things like that. Maybe he doesn't think that that's a popular enough mainstream position in the suburbs of Toronto, for instance, where his party is going to try to rebound in the next election. So I think he's going to try to speak broadly about this idea of letting parents raise their kids and parental rights and common sense. But eventually he is going to be forced to, I think, come to the table with a specific answer to what she's doing, whether he supports it or not.
Kelly, what are your thoughts basically on how this is going to play out in Alberta? Because we did see protests over the weekend there. You've mentioned some of the polling. Like, what's your sense of where Albertans sit on this?
I think the fight against this is going to continue as long as this stands to be a policy for the UCP government. I think it could galvanize people in a way. We saw Naheed Nenshi, the former mayor of Calgary with a very high profile, give a speech at a rally in Calgary on Saturday that's been widely circulated on social media and talked about in terms of whether he would consider a run for the Alberta NDP, which of course has just started its leadership race. And I think it is going to become a part of that leadership race as well. And I think, I think back to Danielle Smith. She actually said a year ago or during her early time at getting back into politics that she did not want these kids to become a political football. And that has changed in a major way. And what it also is striking to me is that it does set up opponents to her plans to answer what they would do differently. And I think that will be a difficult navigation, whether you're talking about for the federal Liberals or the Alberta NDP, based on the polling that there is parental concern. And what her advisors say is that they're amazed that other parties are so offside with this. I think it will set off a whole chain of political reactions that we couldn't have noticed. And I think, Vassy, your point about her speaking about what may happen in Alberta is such an important one too. Reporters did ask her for the stats on surgeries, on transitions, and it isn't significant in Alberta. It's almost, and she talks about what's happening in Europe. She talks about what's happening in states.
Yeah.
And, even though she has talked about Europe, she's taking in a very American route in this. We have seen states legislate on this. In Europe, it's medical bodies advising on this.
Yes, very much so. Okay, I have to leave our conversation there. Thank you so much to the front bench, Kelly Kreiderman, Dan Moulton, Shakir Chambers, Laura Stone, and Carl Bélanger.